Welcome to the 2022 Volume 3, Issue 2 Winter Podcast Edition, Part 1 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion, published June 1, 2025. All contents are protected under the Creative Commons, Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives, 4.0 International Deed. For figures, citations, notes, and references, please refer to the printed articles at www.jpeonline.org. Part 1. Table of Contents. Alpitera Andreas. 2022. Précis. Propelled. How Boredom, Frustration, and Anticipation Lead Us to the Good Life. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, No. 2, 1-9. https://doi.org/10-33497/2022 Wintered 1. Contisai Filippo. 2022. Balance or Propel? Philosophy and the Value of Unpleasantness. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, No. 2, 10-18. https://doi.org/10-33497/2022 Winter.2. Hardcastle Valerie. 2022. Challenges versus Frustrations and Non-Rewards versus Punishments. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, No. 2, 19-26. https://doi.org/10-33497/2022 Winter.3. Pismini Arena. 2022. Boredom and Its Values. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, No. 2, 27-34. https://doi.org/10-33497/2022 Winter.4. Gallegos Francisco. 2022. Emotional Depth, Ambivalence, and Effective Propulsion. Journal of Philosophy of Emotion 3, No. 2, 35-43. https://doi.org/10-33497/2022 Winter.5.
Article 1. Précis. Propelled. How boredom, frustration, and anticipation lead us to the good life. By Andreas Alpitera. The importance of questions. Books often ask questions. They also offer right or wrong, partial or complete answers. Asking the right questions is key. If answers are the celebratory conclusions of an inquiry, questions are the humble but exciting beginnings. The topic of asking the right questions is masterfully broached in Ursula Le Guin's 1969, The Left Hand of Darkness. The book tells the story of Genly AI, a male envoy who is sent to the frigid planet Get-Hen to invite its leaders to join an interstellar coalition. During one of his adventures, Genly meets the foretellers of the Handara and is granted the opportunity to ask whether his mission would prove to be successful. Before he can pose his question, however, he is told by his guide that he more qualified and limited the question is, the more exact the answer will be. He is also informed, through the telling of a story, of the potential dangers and unintended consequences of assuming that all questions are answerable. Do you know the story of the Lord of Shorth, who forced the foretellers of Ace and Fastness to answer the question, what is the meaning of life? Well, it was a couple of thousand years ago. The foretellers stayed in the darkness for 6 days and nights. At the end, all the celibates were catatonic, the zanies were dead, the pervert clubbed the Lord of Shorth to death with a stone. Pages 63-64. The story is obviously a warning. To Genly, who is about to ask his question, but also to those of us who, like the Lord of Shorth, might be tempted to ask the big questions. So much is clear. What is less clear is the exact content of the warning. I take it that what we are warned about by Genly's guide is not the dangers of merely asking questions. Regardless of how difficult or profound our questions may be, it is inconceivable to suppose that they must somehow come to an end. How could we be denied that opportunity? How else would we ever learn, discover, and grow? So, what we are being cautioned against isn't the practice of asking questions. It is something else. It is the pitfalls of asking questions while holding on to inappropriate expectations. What is concerning, in other words, aren't the questions themselves, but our interrogative attitudes and presuppositions. To approach the foretellers with a question in mind, one must already be convinced that the question can be clearly answered, or answered once and for all. Hence, to pose the question of the meaning of life to the foretellers is to oblige them to try to do what might not be possible. This is the warning that Genly's guide delivers. The moral of the story, then, isn't that the question of the meaning of life is unanswerable. It is instead the realization that whether the question is unanswerable or not depends largely on what type of answer we are seeking. If we are convinced that the question admits of a singular answer, then the question might indeed be unanswerable. Yet if we ask the question as a way of exploring what it means to live a human life and are willing to allow ambiguity, historical contingencies, human biases, and subjective preferences to shape its answer, then the question is transformed. It is now not just an answerable question, but perhaps one that we must, for our own benefit, try to answer. If a meaningful life is part of the good life, then the question of the meaning of life is an integral part of our investigation into the character of the good life. And so, Propelled asks about the meaning of life obliquely by asking about the character of the good life directly. It does so, however, while heeding the guide's warning. It recognizes that there might not be just one answer to the question, what is the good life? Further, it acknowledges that the question itself might be vague or even ill-defined. In what sense? Whose life are we considering? And is there such a thing as the good life? All the same, Propelled attempts to make progress in our examination and understanding of the good life, not by necessarily settling the question, even though the book does offer an answer, but by approaching the question from the perspective of negative experiences. Propelled might be about the good life, but it is primarily about how certain effectively laden psychological states contribute to or hinder the pursuit of such a life. It asks, can boredom, frustration, and anticipation contribute to the good life? If so, how much? In what ways? Under what conditions? And what can they teach us about the character of the good life? Such questions, the book argues, are important. They pave the way for an understanding of the nature of the good life that is realistic and doesn't shy away from life's inevitable obstacles and failures. The questions also allow us to see more clearly the role that emotions play in our personal and social lives. Propelled finds much richness and value in our complex, but often painful psychological experiences. It attempts to articulate how they may be our guides and motivations for a life that is, to the extent that is possible, one's own. The unpleasant states that move us. The book focuses on boredom, frustration, and anticipation. It argues that these psychological states play a valuable role in human life, so much so that they ought to be considered, if certain conditions are met, elements of the good life. To be clear, they are elements of the good life, not because they are indications of the attainment of the good life. Instead, they are elements of the good life insofar as all three states are helpful tools in our pursuit of the good life. To understand this central claim of the book, it is instructive to begin from the contention that boredom, frustration, and anticipation are different ways in which we find ourselves stuck in the present. The idea of entrapment that is operative in the book does not reduce to the literal or physical sense of the word. Being stuck in the present does not mean that the present moment is somehow inescapable, persistent, or endlessly lingering. Rather, we are stuck in the present insofar as in the present we are confronted with a situation that is not desirable to us. Even though the present may afford us with opportunities, often numerous and diverse in nature, those are not, in an important sense, our own opportunities. They are not ones that we have chosen for ourselves, or if we have once chosen them, we no longer desire them. They don't appeal to us and are perceived neither as meaningful nor as engaging. In all three states, the now fails to satisfy us. It traps us, we might say, without entrancing us. We are not lost in the moment. Rather, we are acutely aware of its unpleasant grip and we wish to escape it. As such, the three psychological states obtain their meaning and significance not just from the fact that we are entrapped in the moment, but also from our desire to escape and reach beyond it. Indeed, all three states are characterized by our desire to alter, bend, or somehow counteract time. We wish to replace the unsatisfying now with a promising future, an appreciation of our relationship to time. As such, a relationship is manifested in these three psychological states, allows us to bring to the fore the importance that such states carry for our own well-being. First, the three states reveal to us in an immediate and effective manner how we are faring in the world. For more on this, see Chapter 2 of Propelled. They are informative both of our own interests, desires, and goals, but also, and more importantly, of how our present situation measures up to those interests, desires, and goals. Boredom tells us that what we are doing is not what we want to be doing. Frustration discloses to us simultaneously both our dissatisfaction with the present and our desire to overcome it. And anticipation informs us of the value that we have placed in a future event. Thus, in their own ways, these states make evident to us that there is something that we are not yet accomplishing. They are reminders that what matters to us is not found in the present, but in what lies ahead. Boredom, frustration, and anticipation can tell us what matters to us and what is not. But they do more than that. On account of their experiential, physiological, and cognitive characteristics, they can act as motivating mechanisms that push us to pursue what is important to us. While boredom and frustration are unpleasant, anticipation is not, at least not necessarily and not in all of its varieties. Yet all these three states set us on a trajectory to seek what is truly our own. The aversive nature of boredom gets us out of uninteresting, non-stimulating, and meaningless situations and into ones that we find to be more congenial to our aims and goals. Bench and Lynch 2013, Elpidera 2018. The unpleasantness of frustration allows us either to continue to pursue what we take to be important or ultimately to give up and reprioritize our desires. Finally, anticipation keeps us motivated and helps us to strive to achieve and to care for what we deem to be worth pursuing. Given their functions, we can afford neither to live without these states nor to ignore them. Or so Propelled argues. A world in which nothing is boring is a world in which everything, even that which is most humdrum or mundane, is interesting. A world in which nothing is frustrating is a world in which nothing thwarts our desires. It is, in other words, a world in which we are too easily satisfied, cf. Kupperman 2006. And a world bereft of anticipation is a world in which there is nothing to look forward to. Such worlds are distant and foreign to us. If we were to live in them, we would constantly run the risk of becoming stuck in the present. We would be unable to go beyond the present moment, to develop our own projects, and to author the narrative of our own lives. If everything strikes us as interesting, if the world constantly and too easily satisfies us, and if there is nothing that we anticipate, then we ultimately occupy a world that carries none of our own personal values. Whatever else the good life is, it is arguably also a life that bears a certain relationship to us, the subjects of this life. That is, it is a life with which we identify, or at least for which we care. To create a sense of identification or care, we have to find and invest in personal and social projects. De Beauvoir, 2004. Such an involvement with one's life requires that we create, seek out, and sustain systems of values, that we develop as agents by having to distinguish between what we find interesting, meaningful, and valuable and that which is not, that we persevere in the face of obstacles and loses, and that we figure out what projects to pursue and what images of self-identity to try to realize. Boredom, frustration, and anticipation serve those aims. They might not make our lives easier, but they make them distinctively ours. Chapter summaries. What Propelled sets out to show is that difficulties, hardships, and states of psychological discontent don't mark the unattainability of the good life. Indeed, our conception of the good life should be expanded so that its attainment is possible not despite their presence, but in virtue of them. Cf. Elpidera 2018, Frankel 2006, Gopnik 2020, Oishi et al. 2020. And so, the book begins by motivating and defending this expanded view of the good life. Chapter 1 explores the character of the good life and its relationship to happiness, pleasure, and positive emotions, and examines the effects of emotional adaptation and emotional diversity on psychological well-being. Moreover, the chapter argues that a good life is consistent with the presence of negative psychological states. In doing so, it puts forth a broad conception of the good life that doesn't amount to the presence of positive experiences and the absence of negative ones. Chapter 2 offers a characterization, but not a theory, of emotions. It focuses primarily on the role that such affective states play in our lives. The chapter pays special attention to real-life examples of agents who have lost the ability to experience certain emotions or who have an attenuated capacity to experience or recognize emotions. On the basis of such examples and case studies, the chapter articulates and defends three basic claims about the nature and outcomes of emotions. First, emotions are often transformative. They bring about changes, often remarkable and radical, in how we experience our world. Second, emotions are embodied and felt appraisals of our situations, and as such they reveal to us what matters to us and what is not. Third, emotions are crucial in helping us to navigate the world. They are capable of prompting us to action and of affecting our dealings with ourselves and others, and they do so often in ways that are advantageous to us. Chapter 3 focuses on the perception of the passage of time. It draws upon both relevant psychological research and descriptions of first-personal experiences of individuals whose experiences of the passage of time have been altered in order to show that the manner in which we experience the passage of time has important consequences for our well-being. The chapter considers the experience of feeling stuck in the present and relates it to the three psychological states that are the focus of the book: boredom, frustration, and anticipation. Moreover, it argues that being stuck in the present is a sign of being faced with situations that are incongruent to our goals and wishes. The next two chapters are devoted to an investigation of the character of boredom. Chapter 4 offers an accessible introduction to boredom. In addition to describing boredom and its effects, it is primarily interested in articulating the reasons why boredom has often been understood to be either a trivial or an inconsequential experience. The chapter argues that such an understanding of boredom is problematic. By drawing a distinction between state boredom and trait boredom, it illustrates the various ways in which these two kinds of boredom can be harmful for our well-being. The chapter concludes by suggesting that a more positive and beneficial side to boredom exists, even though it has gone largely unnoticed. Chapter 5 extends the discussion of boredom. It surveys recent empirical findings on the character of boredom and its relationship to self-regulation in an attempt to provide a theoretical account of state boredom that elucidates its role in our everyday lives. The chapter defends a functional characterization of boredom that maintains that boredom is a regulatory state that prompts the pursuit of interesting, meaningful, and engaging activities when our current goals and activities cease to be perceived as such. On the basis of this functional account, the chapter argues that boredom can contribute to our quest for the good life insofar as it can help us discover and engage with activities that are congruent to our projects. Chapters 6 and 7 are concerned with the emotional experience of frustration. Both chapters aim to explicate the character of frustration and to illustrate that it is a powerful and useful psychological mechanism. Chapter 6 presents findings from the last 80 or so years of research on the psychology and neuroscience of frustration and argues that although frustration is an aversive experience that signifies, very often, the presence of an unfulfilled or obstructed goal, it is extremely energizing. Frustration, the chapter shows, is an effective state that can invigorate us in the face of perceived difficulties and in doing so, can provide us with the resources needed to keep pursuing our goals. Whereas Chapter 6 is concerned primarily with illustrating the motivating value of frustration, Chapter 7 discusses frustration's capacity to structure our lives by endowing them with layers of significance and personal meaning. By discussing both experimental findings and real-life situations, the The chapter articulates and defends the contention that projects that we experience as frustrating, difficult, or effortful become valuable in virtue of the fact that they are frustrating, difficult, or effortful to us. In this way, feelings of frustration and effort often lead to the generation of personal value and significance. Anticipation is examined in chapters 8 and 9. Chapter 8 begins by making a case for the indelible role that anticipation plays in our lives. Through its discussion of predictive coding, memory, anticipatory and anticipated emotions, and existential views of human existence, the chapter illustrates how important and prevalent anticipation is in our lives. By demonstrating both the ubiquity and significance of anticipation, the chapter ultimately makes the case that a philosophical investigation into the good life cannot ignore anticipation's workings and effects. Chapter 9 carries the book's investigation of anticipation a step further. It shows the benefits, but also potential dangers, of anticipation, especially when it is considered in relation to the pursuit of the good life. The chapter focuses on articulating how anticipation can contribute to subjective well-being and shows that it is correlated with a number of positive health outcomes. It also considers its value and role in decision-making, savoring, optimism, and as a motivating mechanism that can offer us emotional energy to shape our lives and to pursue what we deem to be significant and important for us. Finally, Chapter 10 brings together the conclusions of previous chapters and demonstrates how the three psychological states are related both to each other and to the good life. The chapter discusses the psychology of self-regulation and presents empirical findings that illustrate that the ability to move from one state to another contributes to our well-being and allows us to be more successful in achieving our goals. Insofar as boredom, frustration, and anticipation ensure that we keep moving and that we do not remain stuck in situations that fail to meet our expectations and desires, they become elements of the good life. The good life is not something that happens to us. It is instead something that we actively strive for and bring about. By relaxing happiness grip on the good life, Propelled explores how one can pursue the good life even when we are struck with what might be called psychological misfortunes. Bouts of boredom, flashes of frustration, and feelings of anticipatory dissatisfaction, a longing not for what we have but for what is to come, indicate neither the absence of a good life nor necessarily a failure in our attempts to attain it. Such negative experiences are instead opportunities to redirect our pursuits and to energize our efforts. Boredom, frustration, and anticipation can thus contribute to the pursuit of the good life by pushing us out of an unsatisfactory present and into a better future. Instead of a conclusion, Propelled is written with an interdisciplinary audience in mind. It is a book for philosophers interested in the psychology of emotions and anticipation, and for psychologists interested in the implications of their research for the nature of the good life. But it is also a book for non-specialists, for those who are curious about the role that emotions, especially negative ones, can play in our lives. Boredom, frustration, and anticipation are common psychological states. For that reason, descriptions of their nature will ring familiar to readers. However, the fact that such states are familiar, common, or even in a sense mundane does not mean that they are not important, nor does it mean that they should be overlooked. Propelled is an attempt to illustrate the richness and value that lies in them. Article 2. Balance or Propel? Philosophy and the Value of Unpleasantness by Filippo Contisai. Contemporary Anglophone philosophy of mind has, in the last couple of decades, been characterized in large part by a growing trend of rediscovering pre-analytic philosophical approaches, such as phenomenology. It has often done so in an attempt to make those older approaches more palatable to broadly analytic tastes. Some of those attempting this have used cognitive science in order to build bridges between analytic and pre-analytic approaches. Andreas L. Pitera, 2020, appears to do something similar with existentialism. In other words, he seems to use cognitive science to bridge the divide between analytic philosophy and existentialism. The result is a highly readable book that will persuade most readers of its main claim, that the three prima facie unpleasant or negative psychological states of boredom, frustration, and anticipation are importantly beneficial to living the good life. I will not contest that claim here. However, if one of the aims of his book is to also create a rapprochement between existentialism and analytic philosophy, then that aim is less than optimally achieved. In this critical discussion, I would like to probe the breadth and depth of the philosophical engagement Elpidera carries out in his book. In the first section, I raise concerns about the relative importance in the book of Elpidera's reporting of empirical work as opposed to his philosophical engagement with that work and the issues discussed. I point to a few instances of previous philosophical work arguing for similar claims that Elpidera does not acknowledge. Moreover, I discuss a couple of instances in which Elpidera's book is, respectively, less accurate or critical in using empirical work for his philosophical claims. In Section 2, I point out some issues on which Elpidera might have achieved greater clarity and precision of analysis. Finally, I point to a long-standing philosophical debate on the positive value negative emotional experiences can have, viz., the aesthetics debate on the so-called paradox of negative emotions. Although Elpidera does not engage with this debate, I draw on some contributions to it to show some potentially useful lines of further enrichment of the book's treatment of both artistic and real-life experiences of boredom, frustration, and anticipation. Science and philosophy. One striking way in which the empirical approach has, in Elpidera's book, greater prominence over the philosophical is in terms of the much greater number of empirical than philosophical studies it discusses. The book discusses Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre more than once, and, on a few occasions, Elpidera offers his own existentialist analyses of some thought experiments or artworks. Especially thought-provoking in the latter respect is, for instance, his discussion, towards the end of the book, of Herman Melville's titular character in Bartleby. The scrivener, e.g., Bartleby, wills nothing. He merely prefers. Elpidera 2020, page 152. However, such discussions are typically shorter and less articulated than Elpidera's reporting of empirical studies. Moreover, there certainly are other prominent discussions elsewhere in philosophy of some of the three psychological states at hand that the book might have discussed. I have in mind, for instance, Schopenhauer's views on boredom and our constant lack of satisfaction, e.g., life swings like a pendulum to and fro between pain and boredom, and these two are in fact its ultimate constituents. Schopenhauer, 1859-1969, Volume 1, page 312. Schopenhauer's views might have, for instance, enriched Elpidera's discussion of the empirical research on emotional adaptation. Elpidera 2020, 5FF, at least by way of recognizing previous proponents of similar philosophical ideas. Likewise, Elpidera's discussion of psychological studies on self-administration of electric shocks to escape states of boredom, Elpidera 2020, pages 55 to 57, would have been nicely complemented, if only again for the sake of acknowledging past contributions, by a discussion of Edmund Burke's view that we sometimes seek moderately negative emotions to escape the dullness of boredom. Burke, 1757-1958. Overall, however, the cognitive science results reported in the book quite convincingly support the book's main claim. Nonetheless, such results are, perhaps too often, not discussed with sufficient care or with enough of a critical eye. Chapter 5, for example, reports an experiment designed to test the psychological plausibility of the beginning of the fictional story told by Lewis Carroll in Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. In this experiment, Elpidera reports, Van Art al. 2010, subjects were given boring stimuli or tasks while they were in a room that featured an entrance in the wall or a rabbit hole. All subjects, by the end of the experiment, made their way to the entrance of the rabbit hole. The researchers, emphasizes Elpidera, take this result as showing that boredom acts as an effective motivator by pushing subjects to enter the rabbit hole. That boredom is effective in pushing people out of it is hardly a claim I want to contest. However, There are features of the experimental setting of the study Elpidera relies on that make me doubt how strongly its results support Elpidera's claims. First, it is worth noting that the experimenters themselves emphasize the role of boredom a little less than Elpidera does. By and large, in fact, they talk of the motivational power of the combination of boredom and curiosity. Indeed, the individual role of boredom in the experiment appears quite limited. For instance, the obvious presence of an entrance in the wall of a room in which a modern psychology experiment is conducted would on its own, without any special contribution from boredom, seem to be sufficiently curiosity-inducing to push many subjects to attempt its exploration. Of course, I can imagine some scenarios that would grab our attention more than the experimenter's rabbit hole, but given the context, I expect them to be few in number. Similarly, in such relatively ordinary contexts as the one presented in the experiment, the presence of a pink-eyed, rabbit-like robot dressed as a human should appear sufficiently extraordinary to stimulate one's curiosity, whether or not one is bored. Moreover, in a later stage of the experiment, the rabbit, on behalf of the experimenters, explicitly asks the subject who have not yet followed it through the rabbit hole to do so. At this stage, subject compliance might well become such a strong factor that any role boredom, or even curiosity, might have had up to that stage is overshadowed. Another instance in which Elpidera's argument might have benefited from a more careful handling of experimental results concerns the IKEA study referenced in Chapter 7 of the book, Norton et al., 2012. Elpidera discusses this experimental study as showing that invested effort in something typically makes us value that thing more. This, in turn, argues Elpidera, shows us that we do indeed give value to the frustration that often accompanies our efforts. Again, it is far from an implausible claim that we often give some value to effort. However, it is not clear to what extent the study reported by Elpidera supports his point. In the experiment, he reports, subjects are asked to attribute monetary value to IKEA furniture that they had either assembled themselves or that was pre-built by others. The result was that subjects attributed a 63% higher value to the former class of furniture when compared to the latter. Combined with previous studies and with the other experiments described in the same study, this leads Norton et al. To conclude that the effort one expends in building something adds value to it. However, a closer look at the Norton et al. Study gives a less straightforward picture. As we saw, previous experiments, dating back at least from the 1950s, had already supported the conclusion that we value effort. By contrast, the specific contribution of the Norton et al. Study is, by their own design, to control for the role of the successful versus unsuccessful completion of the subject's effortful aim. Indeed, taking into account their follow-up experiments, reported in the same article, Norton et al. Suggests that the crucial factor for the emergence of the IKEA effect is not mere effort, but successful and lasting completion of labor. This is backed by their discovering that no increase in perceived monetary value follows from either unsuccessful completion of subjects' building efforts or the destruction of their artifact by their own hands. The emphasis on successful completion as opposed to mere effort would change the relevance of the experiment for Elpidera. As we saw, in fact, Elpidera's point in this context concerned the value that accrues from the frustration we feel in our efforts. Frustration may follow from unsuccessful completion at least as often as from successful completion of one's efforts. As a consequence, Norton et al.'s study is, in the relevant context, not the most relevant source of evidence for Elpidera's point. Labels and classifications. As Elpidera puts it, his main claim in the book is that the three psychological states of boredom, frustration, and anticipation are essential to our living the good, human, life. As I have already said, I think the book does a good job of convincing its reader of that claim. However, what the claim really amounts to is a little less clear than one might hope. In particular, there are a couple of alternative ways in which the three states at hand might qualify as essential for Elpidera, and it is not obvious which of the two ways he wants to argue for. Given the book's philosophical matrix, One way in which one might be tempted to understand essential is as more or less synonymous with necessary. So disambiguated, Elpidera's claim would then be that without experiencing boredom, frustration, and anticipation, humans cannot live the good human life. This understanding is, however, difficult to square with the kind of evidence that mostly supports the book's main claim. Such evidence, in fact, is mostly derived from scientific studies that largely focus on typical human behavior. To establish necessity, Elpidera might instead need to appeal to empirical data about atypical or exceptional subjects. A second possibility is that the meaning of essential at work in the book is more akin to that of central. So disambiguated, Elpidera's claim would be that the three psychological states at hand are often very important, albeit not necessary, to living the good life. Such an understanding, however, would have the consequence of leaving the possibility open that some, actual or possible, people would be better off without boredom, frustration, or anticipation. But this is difficult to square with some passages in the book that appear instead to endorse an understanding of essential as necessary. This is, for example, the case where Elpidera writes, "Without anticipation, there would be no goals to pursue, no aspirations to aspire to, and no ideals to model one's life after." Elpidera 2020, page 159. At least on the face of things, in fact, this is not a counterfactual claim that is warranted by the kind of evidence offered in the book. It remains therefore unclear what essential should mean in the formulation of the book's main claim. Another ambiguity concerns the ways in which the book's three titular psychological states achieve their essentiality. One way in which they would seem to do so is that they offer a balance between pleasurable and unpleasant states, or between achievement and failure, since it would otherwise be difficult to endure a life of pure pleasantness and achievement. Call this the balancing thesis. A second way in which boredom, frustration, and anticipation can be essentially valuable is in providing us with the motivational impetus to achieve or to get out of unpleasant states. Call this the propelling thesis. Overall, the book seems to suggest that both claims are true and that they both, presumably jointly, provide support for the essential value of boredom, frustration, and anticipation for the good life. Nonetheless, the two are distinct theses, the nature and roles of each of which the book could have more clearly distinguished between. One way in which Elpidera characterizes the propelling thesis is by arguing that the three states of boredom, frustration, and anticipation all promote motion, or are antidotes to stagnation. Accordingly, the emphasis in his book is more on favoring motion than on combating stagnation. However, the emphasis on motion or movement has the consequence of neglecting activity that is less physical and more, say, psychological. The latter, however, would seem to fall under the benefits of boredom and of its fellow psychological states, as Elpidera's own discussions of daydreaming and mind-wandering show. Elpidera 2020, page 60 ff. Indeed, activity might generally have been a better label for what Elpidera has in mind than motion. Yet another area where more clarity would have enriched the book is with respect to the third and final psychological state on which Elpidera focuses, viz. Anticipation. At least to start with, the book draws a parallel between the claims that it puts forward and the potential benefits of emodiversity, Elpidera 2020, page 7 ff. Moreover, the publisher's overview of the book tells us that the book explores how negative emotional states can be beneficial for our well-being, Oxford University Press 2020. However, Elpidera is careful not to formulate his main claim in terms of emotion, or even effect, but in terms of the broader concept of a psychological state. The reason for this, however, is never spelled out explicitly. I presume that at least part of the reason lies in the status of anticipation. There is at least a prima facie folk psychological sense in which all three states Elpidera focuses on are indeed emotions. However, the book for the most part does not talk about the emotion of anticipation. Anticipation as an emotion would seem to be the effective state one is in when one consciously looks forward to some future event, with the possible exception of its discussion of savoring. However, the book only talks about that state or circumstance in which one finds oneself before a possible future event. At least on the face of things, however, these are two different phenomena. We might call the former emotion anticipation to distinguish it from the latter. The dialectic in the book would have been more coherent as well as perspicuous if the book had at least included a discussion of the differences and similarities between these two apparently distinct phenomena we sometimes call anticipation. Another peculiarity of anticipation, or emotion anticipation, about which I would have liked the book to be more explicit, is its valence. The book labels all three states of boredom, frustration, and anticipation as states of disappointment or discontent. While this may be true, the case of anticipation appears more complicated than those of boredom and frustration. Velocity-wise, there would seem to be two kinds of anticipation, i.e., anticipation of positively and of negatively valuable future events. In the former case, one's dissatisfaction can be said to lie in the future events not having occurred yet, whilst in the latter, any dissatisfaction might be in the valence of those events yet to occur. However, this is only a first-pass characterization, and Elpidera's book would have benefited from a greater discussion of both the nature and valence of anticipation. Art and real life. A long tradition in philosophy, which can be traced back at least to Aristotle and continues in contemporary analytic aesthetics, attempts to explain a prima facie contrast between the cases of real life and art. In the latter case, we seem especially prone to attributing value, seeking out, or even enjoying the witnessing of events or of representations of events that would be unpleasant in real life, especially if we were involved in them. Although Elpidera does not cite the aesthetic literature on the topic, his thrust in the book may be understood in part as denying this apparent contrast between art and real life. In both, the book seems to suggest there is value to be gained from unpleasant experiences. Moreover, the three particular states that Elpidera discusses are themselves underanalyzed in the literature on the paradox of negative emotions. Discussing the relevant aesthetics literature would have provided Elpidera's discussion with an established framing of related issues, as well as enriched the aesthetics literature in return. Those that follow are some suggestions for such a reciprocal enrichment. Take Elpidera's evocative discussion of a prima facie boring artwork, such as Eric Satie's composition Vexations, 1893. Elpidera reports Fluxus co-founder Dick Higgins as saying that, contrary to what one might assume, the repetition of the theme of Satie's score for 840 times is boring only at first. After a while, Higgins adds, the piece instead gives way to ever-increasing euphoria. And, eventually, the music becomes an expected part of the listener's very environment. Overall, Higgins concludes, boredom is a necessary station on the way to other experiences. In the case of Satie's composition, in other words, someone finds something interesting or pleasurable in what initially was boring. In this case, boredom, Elpidera quips, forces us to see things anew. Elpidera 2020, pages 35 to 36. In the Satie case, the benefits of boredom seem to fall under the remit of the aforementioned propelling thesis. The emotion of boredom is, in other words, valued for pushing us to find something more valuable elsewhere. Compare this to David Hume's description of a paradigmatic case of negative emotions in art. It seems an unaccountable pleasure, which the spectators of a well-written tragedy receive from sorrow, terror, anxiety, and other passions that are in themselves disagreeable and uneasy. The more they are touched and affected, the more are they delighted with the spectacle. And as soon as the uneasy passions cease to operate, the piece is at an end. Hume, 1757, 1777, Mill, page 216. At least on an initial analysis, the Hume and Satie cases are different from one another. In the former, the audience's pleasure appears immediately and intimately connected with the unpleasantness inherent in the represented events. By contrast, unpleasantness and pleasure appear further apart in the sati case, insofar as the initial experience of boredom pushes the listener to find pleasure in other experiences. Although traditionally important, however, Hume's account is not the only one offered in the literature. Moreover, there may well be other cases in which boredom, or another one of the three states discussed by Elpidera, fit better with Hume's characterization. In yet other cases, the value of a distressful psychological state, such as boredom, might lie in its balancing more pleasurable states, in a sense affording us relief from unalloyed pleasure. This is an interesting source of value that, nonetheless, the aesthetics literature on negative emotions has not much explored. One notable exception is Aaron Smuts, 2007, who argues that one of the values of art is that it offers us experiences that are varied and often include both pleasure and unpleasantness. Another issue on which Elpidera might seem to depart from much aesthetics literature is that of whether we appreciate unpleasant experiences in real life as well as in art. Here again, however, the contrast is not obvious, since this is something with which, for instance, Smuts, 2007, would agree, although with the caveat that similar kinds of unpleasant experiences are appreciated less often and less intensely in real life than in art. Indeed, Burke, 1757-1958, Part 1, Section 15, even suggests that real life might sometimes be more sought out than art, by speculating that the best theatrical spectacle would be less enticing for a crowd of people than a public execution. More generally, there are several aspects of many of the cases Elpidera discusses that might make the cases of art and real life come apart. Elpidera often talks about the value of boredom, frustration, and anticipation for our life, whether or not we appreciate such a value ourselves. Nor does he necessarily talk about enjoying or even seeking out experiences of boredom, frustration, or anticipation. Moreover, the cases often discussed in the aesthetics literature are cases in which our appreciation of the value of an aesthetic experience occurs both consciously and more or less simultaneously with the experience itself. By contrast, Elpidera's cases tend to be cases that one can only value retrospectively or by means of an unusually keen consciousness. More often than real life, art provides us with, for lack of a better word, greater distance from unpleasant experiences. Moreover, it typically presents us with circumstances in which we're not directly involved. In this note, I have focused on some limitations of Elpidera's discussion of the three conditions of boredom, frustration, and anticipation. However, I also hope to have shown how thought-provoking his book has been for this reader, and how much of a spur I hope it can be for future research in more than one philosophical subdiscipline.
Article 3. Challenges versus Frustrations and Non-Rewards versus Punishments, by Valerie Hardcastle. Andreas Elpidera's new book Propelled, How Boredom, Frustration, and Anticipation Lead Us to the Good Life, 2020, abounds with thought-provoking vignettes and curious research findings. He's a good storyteller, and his book is a fun read. And there is much that I believe he got exactly right or was close enough to write that to disagree would only be splitting hairs. But there is one major claim Elpidera makes that I just flat disagree with. I believe that a bit of the book is conceptually muddled and should be sorted out. I try to do some of that sorting here. I am referring to Elpidera's claims regarding frustration. He asserts that while frustration is aversive and oppressive, it is also extremely energizing. Importantly for his argument, frustration can invigorate our responses to perceived difficulties. 2020, page 73. While I appreciate how frustration can be aversive, I have not been able to find my way to accepting that it motivates goal-seeking. My diagnosis for the problem is that Elpidera is oversimplifying what the scientific data on unexpected outcomes indicate, and as a result misinterprets his stories and has a more expansive view of what frustration means than what the common folk, or a technical philosopher, would allow. I shall explain. Intermittent reward schedules and unexpected non-rewards. Elpidera opens his discussion of understanding the motivational qualities of frustration by describing how rats behave under an intermittent reward schedule, also known as a variable ratio schedule. Miltenberger, 2008. What is key for these experiments is that the rats have developed an expectation of a reward for some behavior. When they produce a previously rewarded behavior, and then do not receive the expected reward, their response is to repeat the rewarded behavior even more energetically to get the reward they were denied. Alpidera notes that the rat's behavior has been called the frustration effect, and suggests that it is an emotional reaction to an expectation denied. But, of course, naming something as a frustration effect does not mean that the rats were actually frustrated. Intermittent reward schedules are a well-known and well-studied part of the operant conditioning literature, and they impact all sorts of human endeavors. It is well documented that if you want to train a creature to behave in a certain way, then you should provide them with the regular rewards for the desired behavior. Creatures learn more quickly and exhibit the behavior more robustly when they do not receive a reward each time they do what they have been trained to do. People who train dogs know this. Parents who raise children learn this quickly. And gambling casinos make millions off of slot machines using this principle. This principle also explains why video games like QWOP, which require an esoteric physical skill that one has to practice for hours on end to acquire, are so popular. In QWOP, you use the keys of a keyboard to move body parts on a virtual person to help that person run. Because most of us do not normally pay explicit attention to how we need to move our body parts in order to run, we have a very difficult time translating our implicit knowledge into keystrokes. Indeed, those who lose proprioception in real life find that they have to relearn how to move through space by now consciously and deliberately moving each limb. Walking is a huge challenge and can require significant attention even after years of practice. Cole 2016. In QWOP, the reward for the gamers playing is making the toy human move as they intended. Each time they achieve this goal, they get a small psychological boost. By their effort, they achieved what they were trying to do. But they are not successful every time they try. Sometimes, despite their best efforts, they get the non-reward of the virtual person falling down. The behavioral response is to double down and try again. Small rewards coupled with unexpected non-rewards leads to persistence. Papini 2003, 2006. And this double-down response explains a lot of human behavior. Why people spend hours doing everything from trying to perfect the three-point jump shot to timing themselves completing the Sunday crossword puzzle. Alpidera notes that the author of QW explains the fascination with his game by claiming that frustration can, counterintuitively, be quite pleasurable. Page 78. But an unexpected non-reward is not the same thing as a frustrating emotional experience, despite labeling it as such. Certainly, claiming that frustration is pleasurable is at odds with Alpidera's claim that frustration is aversive. How do we reconcile these opposing interpretations of frustration? The short answer is that we need to distinguish between an unexpected non-reward and an unexpected punishment. Only the latter is truly frustrating in an emotional sense. Or at least, these unexpected consequences are two different types of events that have different impacts on creatures, so we should probably call them by different names. I am claiming that unexpected punishment is more akin to the lay interpretation of frustration than an unexpected non-reward. Frustration and unexpected punishments. Let us compare the psychological reactions and behaviors one finds with intermittent reward schedules with what we find in what I suggest are cases of unexpected punishment. Intermittent reward schedules produce more of the rewarded behaviors than schedules that reward each time the behavior is enacted. According to Amsel's frustration account, 1992, an unexpected non-reward is a complex aversive experience. Initially, primary frustration occurs when no reward is received. This leads to secondary frustration, which is the expectation of future non-rewards. This secondary frustration then gets paired with the actual future reward, received with an intermittent reward schedule, which ultimately leads to behavioral persistence. However, recent studies using more ecologically relevant tasks across a wide range of mammals, instead of relying only on rats running mazes, suggest an alternative interpretation of what increases motivation that does not rely on any accompanying aversive states. Reimner, Thompson, and Berman 2018. In particular, and consistent with Amsel's view, the functional search hypothesis holds that behavior moves from consumption to exploration when animals receive a lower than expected value reward. E. Flaherty 1996, Papini 2003-2006. However, the frustration hypothesis also predicts that creatures would avoid the locations in which they experience aversive frustration, But the more naturalistic studies did not find this to be the case. Instead, results dovetail with ecological models of patch exploitation, which hold that foraging switches from a patch to sampling the environment when yield is less than expected. Bernstein, Kaselnik, and Krebs 1988. The implication of these studies is that unexpected non-rewards could provoke a non-effective functional response of increased motivation to explore available alternatives instead of any particular emotional response at all. In any event, it appears premature to conclude that an unexpected non-reward feels aversive in any deep sense. Behavioral psychologists distinguish between allocentric and egocentric learning. The former refers to tracking changes in the environment, the latter to tracking emotional responses to environmental change. One can have the former without the latter. I am suggesting that this is exactly what happens in cases of unexpected non-reward. An unexpected non-reward provokes tracking environmental changes, but it need not lead to any effective reaction to these changes. In contrast, unexpected punishments lead to quite different outcomes. The examples that Elpidera cites regarding cases of aggression following an unexpected loss, Elpidera 2020, page 79, are examples of unexpected punishments. These are different than simply not getting an expected reward, for, in these cases, there are emotional responses to environmental changes being tracked as well. Elpidera quite rightly questions the direct causal link that some wish to make between frustration and violence, but the correlation data stand nonetheless. That is, having a football game called on account of rain is different from losing to an opponent you expected to beat. The former is much less likely to result in acts of aggression or violence than the latter. The reason is that spectators not getting to view the game now, but perhaps being able to see it later while disappointing, is not an aversive experience to track, but rather an environmental correlation to notice. In contrast, the latter truly is a loss. Spectators who watch their favored team lose do experience something aversive, and they can lash out because of it. Being on the receiving end of an unexpected punishment evokes an emotional reaction in spectators. We can also see this distinction in Elpidera's own discussion of chronic pain. In some cases, patients experience chronic pain as an unexpected punishment. In others, patients experience chronic pain as an unexpected non-reward. The patients who exclaimed, "My back pain is ruining my life. It has robbed me of my right to a better, more enriched lifestyle," 2020, page 88, and "I resent my body for failing me, especially when I work so hard to be good to it," page 89, are experiencing their pain as a punishment. But those who explain, "I refuse to let back pain interfere with my life," page 89, or "It hurts, it sucks, but you know, such is life," page 89, are experiencing their pain as a non-reward. The patients who experience chronic pain as a punishment often, as indicated in the text, feel consumed by the pain, page 88, which could be another way of saying that they engaged in tracking their emotional responses to pain. And doing so zaps their motivation and interferes with life's pleasures. While I cannot say that patients who experience their chronic pain as a non-reward see it as something pleasurable, I do claim that they find it as a challenge that requires effort and dedication, an expression of increased motivation perhaps and a willingness to explore new options. Importantly, we can see that the same event is not read by all individuals in the same way, even under what appear to be similar circumstances. One person's punishment might be another's non-reward. I would argue that Elpidera's reaction of despair and scornful self-blame, 2020, page 81, to software crashing and losing a document before it was saved is one of an unexpected punishment. Elpidera experiences loss with the crash. On the other hand, some react by shrugging, rolling their eyes, rewriting the document, and developing new protocols against information loss. In these instances, the crash was just perceived as an unexpected outcome in which they did not get what they anticipated, but not as maltreatment by the computer gods. In cases in which we have an unexpected outcome that is thoroughly unpleasant, in which we are made vividly and painfully aware that what you desire can't be obtained, Elpidera 2020, page 73, we are egocentrically experiencing frustration at what is perceived to be an unexpected punishment. We are tracking our emotional response to an environmental event. But in cases in which the unexpected outcome can provide us with the psychological resources needed to keep pursuing our goals, page 73, we are experiencing an unexpected non-reward. We are allocentrically noticing changes in our environment, and using this information to explore different responses. Valued pursuits and a life worth living. Having this distinction in hand also explains Elpidera's odd and rather contradictory account of Andrew Wiles pursuing Fermat's last theorem. While it is true that Wiles stumbled on this problem as a child and thought he wanted to solve it, it is not quite true that he devoted his life to Fermat's last theorem. Elpidera 2020, page 97. At the same time, he did work on the solution for several years as an adult, in solitude for 6 years and then publicly for the next 2. And he and his graduate student published what is now regarded as the definitive solution in 1995, Sing 1997. On the one hand, Elpidera claims that Fermat's last theorem frustrated Wiles, and it's that frustration that made the theorem a central part of Wiles's life. 2020, page 98. But on the other hand, Wiles muses, "You might ask, how could I devote an unlimited amount of time to a problem that might simply not be soluble? The answer is that I just loved working on this problem," as quoted on page 98. "And this was my childhood passion. There's no other problem in mathematics that could hold me the way Fermat did," as quoted on 99. Just loving working on something or having a lifelong passion does not sound like something I, at least, would describe as frustrating. A challenge, yes, and something that requires considerable attention and effort, yes, but not something that is fundamentally unpleasant. Wiles's comment that, "I was obsessed. I enjoyed pitting my wits against it," as quoted on page 98, sounds more like gamers playing QW than spectators gnashing their teeth over their team's loss. Working on difficult cognitive problems are cases of reinforcement by intermittent schedules. Making tiny advances, seeing some progress but not always advancing or progressing despite trying to, is not in and of itself frustrating. This is just what intermittently reinforced challenges are. Enticements to explore new options and to try again. As Wiles notes, one has to be able to accept this state of being stuck. One is part of the process and you have to learn to enjoy that process. You have faith that over time you will understand, as quoted on page 100. Elpidera is entirely correct when he claims that we associate effort with value, 2020, page 108. However, he is incorrect that effort is unpleasant or unrewarding. Indeed, for many it is exactly the opposite. Consider mountain climbing. Elpidera is right that the difficulty of the ascents gives them value, page 111. However, he is wrong that difficult physical challenges carry with them a vast array of predominantly negative emotions and sensations. They're painful, exhausting, frustrating, miserable, and terrifying. But it is because of the negative psychological reactions that they elicit in us that they render our activities meaningful. Page 111. If we set aside the bro culture that pervades extreme sports as well as pop/social media discussions of them, we learn that, not surprisingly, different people engage in extreme sports for different reasons. Personal conversation. The top athletes do it because they enjoy the process and, like the gamers and mathematicians, want to perfect their skills. Others want to feel special by being different. Still others want to see how hard they can push their bodies before they fail. Finally, some want membership in an exclusive club. This is not to say that no moment in an endurance event could be painful, exhausting, frustrating, miserable, or terrifying. There definitely can be. But that is not the predominant experience for those who regularly engage in these sports. Indeed, those who are the best at any of the endurance sports are just like any other expert in a field. They focus on planning, strategy, skills building, and improvement. That is, they focus on how changes in the environment should impact their behavior. They do not focus on how much pain or suffering they may have endured. They are not motivated by negative psychological reactions. Rather, like Wiles, they truly enjoy the process as a learning experience. And like most of us, they are inspired by value-laden and meaningful challenges. They are motivated by perceived unexpected non-rewards, and not by any perceived unanticipated and aversive punishments. In conclusion, I deny Elpidera's assessment that life is hard and frustrating. Because of that, it's one that's worth having. 2020, page 112. For some, life is hard and frustrating, but our sense of a life worth living comes from putting effort into what we value and having that effort at least occasionally reward us. But if life is just one frustration after another, then humans become focused on the emotional reaction itself instead of on how to manage the shifting environment. They shut down, stop trying, lash out, and give up. Article 4. Boredom and Its Values by Irina Pismani. The book is a lot of fun to read. It is engagingly written. It tells us about many results of psychological research that shed light on some of our affective attitudes, and opens up, towards the end, into an attractive invitation to approach life in the spirit of existentialist adventure. Elpidera's aim is to show that boredom, frustration, and anticipation, states that he takes to have negative hedonic character, have the capacity to enhance our lives, and to contribute to human flourishing. To show this, Elpidera aims to develop detailed functional accounts of these states. I present 3 general questions about the project in Section 1. Next, I provide a critical examination of Elpidera's account of boredom. In Section 2, I zoom in on the formal object and aptness conditions of boredom given Elpidera's account. I consider 4 possible ways to characterize the formal object of boredom, and argue that they all fail, leaving the question of the formal object of boredom unanswered. In Section 3, I consider the practical, moral, and aesthetic value of boredom. While I think that practical and moral value of boredom is questionable, it seems that an apology for boredom is best constructed by appealing to its contributions to art appreciation. Its potential to facilitate an aesthetic experience affords it its final value. General remarks. First, it is somewhat puzzling as to why these 3 states were chosen by the author, as it isn't clear what they have in common, or how they relate to one another. Elpidera writes that 1. They all involve feelings of dissatisfaction and entrapment in our current situation, and 2. They can motivate us to remedy the situation. Elpidera emphasizes that this last feature is important because these states not only identify the situation as dissatisfying but also at the same time already contain the potential to liberate us. Page 34. Yet these features are not unique to these states. The action tendencies entailed by many other negative emotions also aim to remedy the situation in some way. For instance, fear aims to correctly identify danger, while at the same time providing us with an action tendency to either freeze or flee. Anger identifies some wrong committed against us, and provides us with the action tendency of aggression to correct the wrong. Negative emotions generally can be construed as indications of one's goals being frustrated. Lazarus, 1991. Thus, it is no surprise that their action tendencies aim at changing one's behavior to realign with one's goals. And it remains unclear what distinguishes the triad Elpidera has decided to focus on from other negative emotions. My second general comment concerns the specific ways in which Elpidera sees these 3 psychological states as contributing to the good life. These include 1. Informing the organism of how they are faring with respect to their goals. 2. Providing a point of contrast in order to reset the system, so that positive experiences do not become mundane and lose their pleasurable qualities. And 3. Potentially enhancing emodiversity, the variety and breadth of our emotional experiences. Page 7. The first point is obviously right since it is what emotions generally do. The second point is also right. But Elpidera is cautious not to overstate the case since negative emotional experiences can turn harmful. One can imagine boredom turning into depression, frustration into rage, and anticipation into anxiety. Elpidera is also clear that we must react to these emotions in appropriate ways in order for them to be beneficial. Page 69. By themselves, they seem to be of neutral value at best. Third, while the research on emodiversity is in its infancy, the results so far do not speak in favor of Elpidera's thesis. As he points out, the research he cites shows that a rich diversity of positive emotions correlates more highly with well-being than a diversity of negative ones. Page 8. In short, the ways these 3 emotions are said to contribute to well-being are not specific to them, and their contribution to emodiversity is not necessarily conducive to the good life. Third, anticipation, despite the features it shares with the other 2 states, still seems to fit oddly into the group. While anticipation is admittedly all too often an emotionally laden experience, it is unclear that it fits the emotion model as well as the other 2 states. In itself, anticipation is a cognitive rather than an emotional state. As illustrated by recent work by Andy Clark and others on the predictive brain, anticipation appears to be the general rule that governs all our perceptual processes and makes it possible for us to respond appropriately to our environment's affordances. Clark, 2016, Friston, 2010. Elpidera himself quite rightly notes that waiting has no inherent valence. Sometimes, anticipation is fraught with anxiety and is highly aversive, At other times, however, anticipation of a certain pleasant experience can itself be savored and enjoyed, even to the point of wanting to delay the anticipated satisfaction. Hence, anticipation is unpleasant in the first case and pleasant in the second, since there is nothing intrinsically negative about it as an emotional experience, and since it is merely a universal brain mechanism in its non-emotional cognitive form, it is difficult to see what it has to do with the other two states discussed by Elpidera. In sum, it isn't clear why these three states should be considered together. Since all three require the agent to take the right attitude towards them to overcome their potentially harmful effects, it is also unclear why we should think they make a specific contribution to the good life. And it seems doubtful that we should think of anticipation as an emotion as opposed to a non-effective cognitive mechanism. Boredom. Leaving these general questions aside, I now turn to Elpidera's discussion of boredom. Elpidera's account of boredom illuminates many of its facets. After reconstructing Elpidera's psychological profile of boredom, I concentrate on the question of the formal object of boredom, the value property of the boring, and boredom's aptness conditions. I briefly consider four possible ways of characterizing the boring. 1. Causally, 2. As analogous to aesthetic value, 3. As the meaningless, and 4. As conflicting with our goals and interests. I give reasons to reject all four, thus leaving the boring currently undefined. Elpidera discusses boredom as a character disposition and a short-lived emotional episode. Both are extremely interesting, but for lack of space I concentrate on boredom as an emotional episode, or what psychologists call state, as opposed to trait boredom. The psychological profile of boredom includes its eliciting conditions, conditions that can in fact cause or trigger the emotion, targets, the objects at which boredom can be directed, formal object, the value property boredom represents its target as having, aptness conditions, condition that make boredom fitting or unfitting, hedonic character and phenomenology and action tendency. The eliciting conditions of boredom are highly varied. Almost anything can bore us. We might also not know why we are bored, or only realize later that we were bored. Page 39. The target of boredom could be virtually anything, the situation we are in or a task we are performing. One feature characteristic of boredom experiences is temporal entrapment, the sense that time is passing very slowly. Page 33. In addition, we feel detached from the situation and cannot find meaning in it. Boredom has a negative hedonic valence. It is unpleasant to feel, and is coupled with a desire to escape it. Elpidera argues that the action tendency of boredom is to terminate the emotion. This can be achieved by either switching to an activity that does not elicit boredom, or by changing one's attitude towards the situation or activity that is currently boring. Pages 59 to 60. The latter strategy is particularly pertinent in cases where the tedious task or situation cannot be avoided. What about the formal object of boredom? Elpidera points out that when bored, one is disengaged and dissatisfied with the situation. There is nothing that interests us about it. Our attention is not grabbed. There is nothing about the situation we want to pursue. We find it meaningless. Elpidera says that boredom has a dual function of 1. Identifying the uninteresting, and 2. Motivating us to escape it. Thus, the formal object of boredom, the boring, is a value property that demarcates the uninteresting. Page 68. But what makes something uninteresting? Prima facie, if something fails to elicit interest in us, it is uninteresting, i.e. boring. We might call this account of the boring a causal account since the value property is cashed out in terms of whatever produces the emotional reaction in question. Might this explain the rich variety of eliciting conditions and targets of boredom? If it happens to make us feel bored, it is boring. However, such an account of the formal object of boredom faces the issue of making sense of the aptness conditions of boredom. Typically, emotions are taken to have representational content, which requires that they represent their targets as grounding their formal objects by way of some features of the target. This means that emotions can misrepresent their targets as grounding a particular kind of formal object. An emotion is apt when it correctly represents the target as having a particular value property. When it misrepresents it, it is inapt. For example, fear is apt when the dog, the target, is dangerous, the formal object. The dog is dangerous if it is large, aggressive, and indicates its intention to attack, features of the target that ground the formal object. On the other hand, fear is inapt if the dog poses no danger. It is a small, cute, friendly puppy. Similarly, we should expect that boredom has representational content, which in turn requires that it is subject to correctness conditions. If this is right, then the causal account will fail to demarcate the boring. In order for boredom to have representational content, it must be possible in principle for it to misfire or misrepresent. Therefore, to specify the correctness conditions of boredom, we must provide a different account of the boring. We need an account of the boring that could in principle identify or demarcate that which is truly boring. Given the variety of conditions and targets of boredom, this seems like an insurmountable task. In light of this, one might reject the idea that boredom has representational content, and instead, model it on aesthetic emotions through which one appreciates the aesthetic properties of an artwork. As the cliché goes, beauty is in the eye of the holder, so might it be with the boring. Yet many resist the total subjectivity of the aesthetic. It seems plausible to maintain that one might sometimes be mistaken in our assessment of a work of art for its aesthetic qualities. So what might be a way out? The boring is contrasted with the interesting. One way to try to specify the value property of boredom, then, is to first explicate the interesting. Elpidera's characterization of the experience of boredom might help. He points out that we experience boredom as meaningless. The meaninglessness in the boring experience might explain why one's attention can find nothing to latch onto, no particular thought or activity to pursue with engagement. Indeed, this is why our minds begin to wander in search for something that might hold our attention. Which things hold our attention? Which things do we find interesting? Psychological research indicates a number of properties that tend to elicit interest, such as novelty, complexity, uncertainty, conflict with our expectations, as well as instant enjoyment. Sylvia 2006. These relate current experience to our previously existing interests, desires, and values. For example, in encountering novelty, we attempt to draw connections with previous experiences and knowledge in order to make sense of the new experience. In encountering something that conflicts with our expectations, we attempt to reconcile it with our existing beliefs. We experience something as meaningful when we are able to draw connections between it and other things that we hold meaningful. If this is right, then one might say that boredom is apt when the experience is meaningless, has no connection with things we care about, and inapt when the target of boredom is meaningful but we fail to experience it as such. Of course, an immediate problem with such an account is that we seem to be able to find meaning in virtually anything, even the unintelligible, if we try hard enough. A speck of dust, the tedium of an office routine, the noise your refrigerator makes can all be imbued with meaning and even interpreted as a comment on the human condition. Elpidera points out that humans are natural meaning makers. Page 6. So the meaningfulness criterion is insufficient to specify the aptness conditions of boredom. Elpidera's characterization of the function of boredom suggests another possibility. Boredom protects us from certain situations. It does so by informing us of the presence of situations that aren't in line with our interests and desires, and by motivating us to do something else. If we were to lack the capacity to be bored, we wouldn't notice when we're faced with an unsatisfying, non-stimulating, or monotonous situation, nor would we do something to get out of it. Page 71. This passage clearly indicates that boredom can get things wrong, which implies that Elpidera does think boredom has aptness conditions. Perhaps the boring is whatever is not in line with our desires and goals, whatever is not relevant to our lives. However, this cannot be right. For some things that are important to us and are congruent with our goals are nonetheless boring. Consider, for example, sitting through a very important lecture. The lecture is important because it contains information that is key to doing well on the exam and later in the profession. Mastering the material presented in it has a direct impact on one's course grade, one's JPE, as well as one's expertise. Still, the lecture is boring. The material is unexciting, a matter of mindless memorizing of the order of the steps in following procedures. Furthermore, the professor is reading directly from lecture notes in a monotonous voice, not making eye contact, making no effort to engage the students. In short, important things that are directly relevant to our goals and interests can be boring. Boredom signifies a lack of interest but not a lack of importance. Page 70. Therefore, defining the boring as what is irrelevant to our interests and desires misses the mark again. The inability to specify aptness conditions for boredom puts pressure on the idea that boredom is an emotion. If emotions typically adhere to a standard of correctness and have representational content, then an account of boredom must be able to specify the conditions under which boredom can be apt and inapt. If it lacks aptness conditions, then it can be said to present rather than represent its target as boring. Boredom comes to seem akin to a perception or a mood rather than a standard emotion. Boredom and its norms. Practical, moral, and aesthetic. The rational assessment of boredom requires that its formal object and aptness conditions be adequately defined. I have not been able to determine what they might be from Elpidorus' Propelled. But boredom can also be assessed from practical, moral, and aesthetic points of view. Let me briefly speculate about each of these in turn. The distinction between aptness and practical use is familiar for other emotions. While the fear of crossing a rickety bridge is apt, the bridge is really dangerous. It is impractical in this situation because it prevents me from achieving my goal of getting to the other side. Similarly, we have seen that boredom is often impractical. While it might have been practical to feel excited about the lecture since one would have gotten more out of it, getting excited was inapt because the lecture was boring. If boredom has a function, as Elpidora insists, it should be of some practical use. What might the practical value of boredom be? Elpidora's answer lies in the twofold function of boredom. Its practical value is to correctly identify the boring, and to facilitate appropriate action. As we have seen, more work is needed to explain how boredom fulfills its first function. What about its action tendency? Elpidora says, boredom offers us direction but only minimally. It tells us, do something more interesting. Page 69. Ultimately, boredom motivates us to stop being bored. Yet, the actions we engage in order to terminate boredom do not necessarily have practical value. We might choose to do housework, to play Candy Crush, or to go smash windows at an abandoned factory. Elpidora is clear that there is no direct link between boredom and useful practical action. While it has interesting and complex connections with mind-wandering and creativity, it is not the only antecedent of these more productive activities. Its practical value seems to be contingent on the kind of action we choose to terminate it. Elpidora's discussion of the connection between boredom and morality demonstrates how boredom can be morally problematic. Historically, it was associated with aesthesia or sloth. The connection between morality and boredom is again cashed out in terms of its dual function. Aesthesia is the sin most common among the medieval monks who failed to appreciate, delight in, and commit themselves to serving and loving God. Pages 43-4. The sin of sloth is the lack of appreciation and interest in life. Boredom becomes morally problematic when a politician does not care about the public good, a judge about justice, a doctor about the health of their patients, a parent about the well-being of their child. Elpidora also discusses the case of German nurse, Niels Hogel, who confessed to murdering his patients during World War II in order to escape the wearisome routine of the hospital. Page 55. All these examples demonstrate how boredom can be morally problematic. Can it be shown to be morally praiseworthy? Elpidora argues that it makes positive contributions to a good life. But I have already raised concerns regarding those arguments. It seems the contributions of boredom to a good life are limited. Yet, one still finds a compelling defense of boredom in Elpidora's Propelled. It comes from situating boredom in art appreciation. While the practical and moral value of boredom is questionable, perhaps it is to our aesthetic experience that boredom has an important contribution to make. That may be the core of its value. Boredom can be thought to be an aesthetic emotion insofar as it affords us special access to art. As Susan Sontag famously wrote in her journal, most of the interesting art of our time is boring. Sontag 2012, page 144. On the face of it, this is a paradox. How can boring art be interesting? Elpidora enumerates examples of boring art. Eric Satie's Vexations, 1893. A Theme of 19 Notes to be Played 840 Times, Andy Warhol's Empire, 1964, and Kenneth Goldsmith's Fidget, 2000. One can think of many of other examples. John Baldessari, I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art, 1971. Charlie Line's Paint Drying, 2016. And numerous works by John Cage and some might feel Philip Glass. What makes them interesting if they are boring? For one, some of them can be taken to be a commentary on boredom itself by way of inducing it by trapping one into a movie theater or a museum. One is forced to face boredom, experience it firsthand, contemplate it, making it the object of one's thoughts, affording a different perspective, thus making it interesting. Second, as Sontag writes, art does not owe us entertainment. Boring art is not an easily accessible art. It requires that we sit with our boredom and endure a state of dissatisfaction that moves us to reflect on it, either finding meaning or meaninglessness. Similarly, Alva No points out that boring art pulls the rug from underneath our feet. It affords no easy explanation, No 2015. Experiencing boredom in an aesthetic context can afford channeling it in just the right way, giving oneself mental space from which one can emerge wandering, exploring, and making meaning. Thus, the role of boredom in affording an aesthetic experience is not only indicative of its practical value and its contributions to a good life, but of its aesthetic and, therefore, final value. Conclusion. Elpidera's book is provocative and exciting. It raises lots of interesting questions and draws numerous connections between philosophical questions and empirical research on boredom, frustration, and anticipation. For my part, I'd like to ask him to say more about boredom's formal object, aptness conditions, and about the ways in which it might have practical or moral value independently of its aesthetic value.
Article 5. Emotional Depth, Ambivalence, and Affective Propulsion by Francisco Gallegos. Let the term affective propulsion refer to the change-inducing quality of an affective state. An emotion is strongly propulsive if it brings about a great deal of change in a person's thoughts, perceptions, feelings, and actions, not merely while experiencing that emotion, but also afterward and in response to it. Unpleasant emotions can be strongly propulsive by spurring us to 1. Make positive changes to our situation, 2. Adaptively alter our perspective on our situation, and or 3. Clarify our values and commitments. In these ways, unpleasant emotions can contribute positively to our lives, despite being unpleasant. In his book, Propelled, How Boredom, Frustration, and Anticipation Lead Us to the Good Life, Andreas Elpidera, 2020, defends the value of boredom and frustration on just these grounds, writing that because these emotions are so effective in helping us become unstuck when we become stuck, page 68. Boredom and frustration play an important and underappreciated role in our pursuit of the good life. Yet, as Elpidera acknowledges, there are many cases in which boredom and frustration are not strongly propulsive, but instead undermine a person's motivation and ability to alter either their situation or their perspective. In such cases, we get stuck, even trapped, in boredom and frustration. This is puzzling. Why are boredom and frustration sometimes quite strongly propulsive and other times only weakly propulsive? Although Elpidera's text offers many relevant insights, it ultimately leaves open this important question. To continue investigating the conditions of the possibility of effective propulsion, I turn to Heidegger's discussion of boredom in his 1929 to 1930 lecture course, The Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics. World, Finitude, Solitude, Hereafter, FCM. In this text, Heidegger compares three kinds of boredom, each of which shares a similar structure but functions at a different level of emotional depth. As we will see, Heidegger claims that the deepest kind of boredom, which we can call deep boredom, is devoid of the unpleasant tension and sense of impatience that is characteristic of everyday boredom, and as such, deep boredom is weakly propulsive. Heidegger's description of deep boredom raises an interesting question. What is it exactly that makes boredom unpleasant? Although we might assume that distress is simply inherent to boredom as such, Heidegger's analysis suggests that both the unpleasantness of boredom and its propulsive quality are made possible by certain aspects of the emotional context in which an experience of boredom is located. In particular, I argue that Heidegger's analysis gives us reason to think that an affective state that is relatively deep can diminish the propulsive quality of an emotion that would otherwise be strongly propulsive, particularly when those subsumed within the deeper affective state's interpretive framework. This suggests that the propulsive quality of an emotion arises not from its intrinsic properties, but from the ambivalence generated when two affective states simultaneously influence our sense-making activity in opposing ways. Boredom is framework and as feeling. In Heidegger's central example of everyday boredom, he describes the experience of becoming bored while waiting for a train. We are sitting in the tasteless station of some lonely minor railway. It is 4 hours until the next train arrives. The district is uninspiring. We do have a book in our rucksack, though. Shall we read? No. Or think through a problem? Some question? We are unable to. We read the timetables or study the table, giving the various distances from the station to other places we are not otherwise acquainted with at all. We look at the clock. Only a quarter of an hour has gone by. Then we go out onto the local road. We walk up and down just to have something to do, but is no use. Then we count the trees along the road, look at our watch again, exactly 5 minutes since we last looked at it. Fed up with walking back and forth, we sit down on a stone, draw all kinds of figures in the sand, and in so doing catch ourselves looking at our watch again, half an hour, and so on. Heidegger, 1962-1995, page 93. I will highlight two aspects of the experience of boredom in this case. First, the way boredom alters how we interpret the things we encounter, or how things show up to us when we are bored, and second, the unpleasantly impatient feeling that suffuses the experience, and then investigate the relationship between these two aspects. With regard to the first aspect of boredom, i.e., the way it functions as an interpretive framework, Heidegger's description of everyday boredom nicely illustrates the analysis given elsewhere by Elpidera regarding the peculiar way boredom reveals the world. In a state of boredom, the world is revealed to oneself in a particular and indeed striking fashion. The world appears not only to be uninteresting, but also distant, foreign, and often unyielding. Boredom contributes to a loss of value, significance, or meaning. The world of boredom is, in a sense, not our world. It is not the world that is in line with our projects and desires. Our current situation does not attract us. We do not feel compelled to engage with it. Elpidera, 2014, page 1247. This aspect of boredom is what is primarily responsible for the sense in which boredom can be difficult to escape. As Heidegger's example illustrates, when we experience the world from within the interpretive framework associated with boredom, our boredom can become atmospheric and corrosive. The quality of boringness seems to spread to every object or event we encounter, thus undermining the possibility of finding relief even in things that would otherwise be interesting and important to us. However, according to Elpidera, the second aspect of the experience of boredom, i.e., its unpleasantness, propels us to find a way out from under the cloud of boredom. Crucially, however, boredom is not a state of equilibrium. We are not content in it. We feel restless and wish to be doing something else. We desire escape from boredom. In turn, while bored, it is difficult for us to focus our attention on features of the present situation. Our mind wanders, and alternative goals and situations suddenly become salient to us. If boredom is likened to an emotional trap, it is a trap that, due to its own character, fortunately pushes us to escape from it. Elpidera, 2014, pages 1247 to 48. Again, Heidegger's analysis of everyday boredom illustrates Elpidera's 2020, page 59, claim that boredom can get us out of our chair precisely because it is unpleasant and it's natural to seek escape from it. In Heidegger's example, boredom prompts the person waiting for the train to move around and do things that they otherwise may not have done, such as explore their environment and try out various activities that might interest them. Moreover, Heidegger, 1995, pages 96 to 97, says that what makes boredom so propulsive in this case is the desire to escape the unpleasant sense that time is dragging, prompting us to do everything in our power to fight against the slowing of time, even confronting it directly with efforts to pass the time. What, then, is the relationship between these two aspects of boredom? Is the unpleasantness of boredom generated somehow from the way that boredom functions as an interpretive framework? Or is the unpleasantness of boredom simply a primitive bodily feeling that has no particular relationship to the more conceptually rich interpretive processes that also happen to be activated when we are bored. These questions ask about why boredom is so unpleasant and why we desire so badly to escape it when it arises. This inquiry may seem obtuse if we simply assume that boredom is inherently or necessarily unpleasant. But on reflection, it is not at all obvious why boredom is so unpleasant. After all, in Heidegger's example, the person waiting for the train is not being threatened, betrayed, or violated. So why does boredom feel so painful that it becomes strongly propulsive? Deep boredom and emotional depth. In my view, understanding these issues requires us to clarify the concept of emotional depth and its relationship to affective propulsion. To see why emotional depth is relevant here, consider Heidegger's description of a case of deep boredom in FCM. In this case, deep boredom emerges suddenly and for no obvious reason as a person walks through the streets of a large city. When this occurs, a profound change takes place in the person's experience, as an entire category of evaluative properties suddenly disappears from their experience. Namely, those evaluative properties that depend on one's sense of being a unique individual with distinctive commitments and concerns, for whom things matter in a personalized way. Because deep boredom completely eradicates one's personally meaningful relationships to things in this way, Heidegger describes the experience with the impersonal phrase, "It is boring for one." It is boring for one. What is this? The it that we mean whenever we say that it is thundering and lightning, that it is raining. This is the title for whatever is indeterminate, unfamiliar. It is boring for one. For one, not for me as me, not for you as you, not for us as us, but for one. Name, standing, vocation, role, age, and fate as mine and yours disappear. Here we become an undifferentiated no one. Heidegger, 1962-1995, page 135. Thus, when we experience deep boredom, we can no longer make sense of how the things around us are relevant to the personally meaningful projects that normally allow us to become absorbedly engaged in activities. We become like tourists who are killing time in a foreign city before our flight back home, with no business in any of the shops, nowhere we need to go, no reason to do any particular thing rather than another, and so able to do nothing more than watch the lives of the people who live there unfold from a detached distance. Heidegger argues that the indifference of deep boredom cannot be explained in terms of the contents of mental states. Deep boredom does not involve an evaluation of each particular object we encounter as being boring. After all, such an evaluation would require an implicit comparison to the possibility of something not being personally indifferent to us, whereas deep boredom entirely removes this sort of possibility from our experiential world. As Heidegger puts it, this indifference of things and of ourselves with them is not the result of a sum total of evaluations. Rather, each and everything at once becomes indifferent. Entities have, as we say, become indifferent as a whole. Heidegger, 1960-1995, page 138. In deep boredom, he continues, W are not merely relieved of our everyday personality, somehow distant or alien to it, but simultaneously also elevated beyond the particular situation. The whole situation and we ourselves, as this individual subject, are thereby indifferent. Indeed, this boredom does not even let it get to the point where such things are of any particular worth to us. Instead, it makes everything of equally great and equally little worth. Heidegger, 1962-1995, page 138. Crucially, then, Heidegger claims that deep boredom does not feel boring because we cannot miss or yearn for what is no longer even intelligible to us. In contrast to the everyday mood of boredom, where time seems to grate and grind against us as it drags along, prompting us to do something to escape from it, in deep boredom, all of this painful dissonance is absent. As Heidegger puts it, in this it is boring for one. We no longer attain this evasion in the face of boredom. Passing the time is missing in this boredom, and indeed, not merely missing but no longer permitted by us at all. Heidegger, 1960 to 1995, pages 135 to 36. By making an entire class of meaning unintelligible to us, we experience a free-floating, unimpeded boredom. Heidegger, 1960 to 1995, page 111. Deep boredom is thus less painful than everyday boredom, precisely because it is also more overpowering. By the time it takes hold of us, it has affected the very structure of our world, a dimension over which the individual person, the public individual subject, no longer has any power. Heidegger, 1960 to 1995, page 136. As such, deep boredom is weakly propulsive to the extreme. Indeed, it is a totalizing world unto itself, one in which we can encounter, and even imagine, nothing dissonant or discontinuous with the boredom that pervades it, and so can find no motivation to do anything to escape from it. Elpidera, 2020, page 46, briefly discusses Heidegger's description of deep boredom, saying that it reflects a form of boredom that bears remarkable resemblance to boredom proneness. In making this comparison, however, Elpidera obscures the nature of emotional depth and its relationship to effective propulsion. Boredom proneness is defined as a condition in which one is, and is disposed to be, frequently bored in a wide array of situations. Elpidera 2020, page 44. But frequency is not identical to depth. In theory, at least, it would be possible to experience a single episode of deep boredom. Indeed, Heidegger claims that deep boredom can erupt out of the blue. Heidegger, 1960 to 1995, page 135, and can take hold of us in an instant like a flash of lightning. Heidegger, 1960 to 1995, page 148. The concept of emotional depth has been discussed by a number of philosophers, e.g., Cataldi 1993, Monteleone 2018, and Mendonça 2019. However, the account I find most compelling and which best fits the cases of boredom described by Heidegger is offered by Matthew Ratcliffe, 2010, in the context of his efforts to shed light on the experience of psychiatric conditions such as major depression. As Ratcliffe notes, it is common for people suffering from major depression to use the language of emotional depth to describe their experiences, often describing themselves as experiencing a deep or even bottomless sense of sadness, despair, guilt, and shame. Ratcliffe argues we can understand emotional depth as follows. Deeper emotions shape the kinds of significance we are receptive to. They are pre-intentional, by which I mean that they determine what kinds of intentional state it is possible to have. A deep emotion could be presupposed by the possibility of a given type of intentional emotion or, alternatively, render impossible. Ratcliffe 2010, page 604. For example, Ratcliffe says major depression often leads to the inability to find happiness in anything, not in the sense of no longer being happy about P, Q, and R, but of gradually losing the sense that anything in the world might offer happiness. Ratcliffe 2010, page 609. The comparison between normal guilt and deep guilt is instructive. When you feel guilty about something, you can still contemplate feeling otherwise, and you do not feel guilty about plenty of other things. But in the case of deep guilt, no alternatives to guilt present themselves. Ratcliffe 2010, page 614. Ratcliffe's phenomenological account of emotional depth thus centers on the way deep emotions function as an interpretive framework and thereby alter what is intelligible to a person. For example, he argues, deep guilt is a shape that constrains the scope of all possible experience. Everything is experienced through the guilt, and the kinds of emotion that are incompatible with guilt are no longer possible. Ratcliffe 2010, page 613. Ratcliffe emphasizes that the kind of impossibility that is involved here should be understood in terms of change in what sorts of states are intelligible. A token deep emotion rules out a type of shallow emotion, and it does so by rendering it unintelligible rather than simply by conflicting with it. Ratcliffe 2010, page 605. Ratcliffe's conception of emotional depth captures the phenomenology of major depression, which is described as hopeless, not merely because of what emotions one can and cannot feel, but because one can no longer even make sense of the possibility of being happy again in the future. In the case of deep boredom described by Heidegger, Ratcliffe's approach clarifies the way that deep boredom brings about a systematic change in one's experiential world, operating at a pre-intentional level by altering in advance what objects are available to encounter, rather than merely altering how one reacts to objects. With this conception of emotional depth in hand, let us now return to the question of what makes boredom so unpleasant and what accounts for its propulsive quality. Ambivalence. In my view, the above analysis gives us reason to think that effective propulsion is a function of emotional depth. The deeper an emotion, i.e., the more totalizing an emotion is as an interpretive frame, the less propulsive it will be. Why might this be the case? The answer, I suggest, is that the deeper an emotion is, the less ambivalence a person will be able to experience. In other words, deeper emotions undermine one's ability to experience contrast, tension, and dissonance between the interpretive frames associated with various emotional states. According to the view I am proposing, boredom will be most unpleasant and most strongly propulsive when it is relatively shallow and so does not totally dominate the way we make sense of the things we encounter. What makes such shallow or normal boredom unpleasant is the dissonance between the interpretive framework associated with our boredom and the other frameworks through which we are simultaneously experiencing the things and situations we are encountering. These other frameworks may be associated with other affective states that we are currently experiencing. In Heidegger's example of being bored at the train station, for instance, boredom seems to compete with the person's concurrent interest in the book they brought along, as well as with their curiosity about the various items in their vicinity. In such moments, I suggest, things show up as somehow both personally meaningful and personally meaningless. This is uncomfortable because it is disorienting. An interpretive frame is a practical orientation in which some small part of the vast and chaotic world is carved off as being what is at stake here and now, thereby enabling us to direct our finite resources in an adaptive manner. When we simultaneously adopt multiple interpretive frames that pull us in opposing directions, this gives rise to the experience of toggling back and forth between practical orientations, or else persisting in a kind of incoherent double vision. Insofar as we have a need and desire to be coherent agents who are well-oriented toward an ordered world, we will be strongly motivated to resolve such dissonance between interpretive frameworks. It is for this reason that relatively shallow boredom is often so strongly propulsive. As boredom deepens, it has more sweeping effects on the way we make sense of things, and as a result, we experience fewer moments of contrast, tension, and dissonance between interpretive frameworks. Thus, the experience of boredom that operates at an intermediate depth is marked by several kinds of emotional disconnection. For example, we may find that certain objects are emotionally inaccessible to us, in the sense that although we can perceptually register their evaluative properties, these qualities cannot seem to reach us, and we remain emotionally numb to them. Likewise, while we may form judgments such as "this is important to me," such judgments fail to have any normative grip, and so they remain merely intellectual and do little to alter our emotional state. In such cases, boredom does not entirely eradicate the class of personally meaningful object from our experiential world, but those objects that show up as personally meaningful will tend to be interpreted as being out of place or too little, too late, and more generally as present but irrelevant to how things matter overall, here and now. Thus, in comparison with shallow boredom, boredom that operates at an intermediate depth will give rise to less interpretive dissonance, and what dissonance does arise will be less practically disorienting. And as we have seen, when boredom becomes maximally deep, one experiences no interpretive dissonance whatsoever. And although the absence of personally meaningful relationships to things leaves one with no practical orientation to speak of, the result is an experience of floating and being untethered rather than disoriented. To summarize, I have argued that boredom is not inherently propulsive, but Rather, the propulsive quality of boredom is made possible by the emotional context in which an experience of boredom is located. In particular, boredom will be most propulsive in an emotional context that is marked by ambivalence, and especially by the disorienting dissonance between the interpretive frameworks of two incongruent affective states that are operating simultaneously. By way of conclusion, let us briefly consider one possible implication of the view of effective propulsion I have offered as it relates to the emotional state of frustration. Elpidera makes a compelling case that, like boredom, frustration is often strongly propulsive, and that the propulsive quality of frustration is valuable insofar as it can greatly accelerate a person's attempts to extricate themselves from an unsatisfactory situation. A similar point is raised in a different context by Sarah Ahmed, 2017, ch8, who argues that members of oppressed social groups sometimes need to snap in a sudden explosion of frustration in order to make difficult but necessary changes to their situation. Ahmed's analysis suggests that such snapping occurs when painful injustices pile up until a person finally cannot take it any longer. However, if my analysis is correct, the depth of the frustration will play a crucial role in this story. If a person's frustration deepens, it can come to function as an interpretive framework through which they make sense of everything they encounter, becoming a corrosive atmosphere of bitterness and resentment that makes everything seem ugly, unjust, pathetic, or petty. Such a mood can persist, and contrary to Elpidera's 2014, pages 1247 to 48, assurance that such an unpleasant affective state will not be a state of equilibrium because we are not content in it. The bitter and resentful outlook of deep frustration can become a new normal, familiar, and habitual, if not entirely comfortable. My analysis suggests that in this case, suffering and witnessing additional injustices may be entirely expected as par for the course, and by thus failing to produce any dissonance or practical disorientation, the frustration such injustices elicit would fail to be strongly propulsive. Surprisingly, then, what would be needed to snap out of deep frustration and snap into action would be an encounter with something that is so profoundly hopeful, beautiful, or righteous that could give rise to an interpretive framework able to generate the ambivalence that is key to effective propulsion.
This marks the end of the 2022 Volume 3, Issue 2 Winter Podcast Edition, Part 1 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion. Please go to 2022 Volume 3, Issue 2 Winter Podcast Edition, Part 2 of the Journal of Philosophy of Emotion to continue listening to this issue.